Mick Faulkner, a farm researcher and advisor in the mid-north of SA. Good to be talking with you on Flow.
Yeah, good morning, Richie. Yeah, it is good to speak to you.
Yeah, I was thinking about you. We were talking to Grain Producers SA and about some research you'd done on the frost issue, certainly with the paddocks looking frosty. We thought we'd touch base with you about how things are looking on the land. You've had to deal with some recently yourself.
Yeah, I guess it's a hard time of the year for broadacre farmers. Always looking for frost, so it doesn't really matter in some ways what happens in winter with the rainfall. We're just always nervous in some areas about the getting frost, especially during spring, because that's when they are the most damaging. And it's a bit concerning to hear already that there's been some frost damage in Eyre Peninsula, or certainly temperatures that indicate there may have been frost damage.
Yeah, and we certainly picked up on this one, seeing over in Western Australia. There's haven't quite yet quantify the damage to the crops, but they're saying it's been pretty bad in the wheat belt over there.
Yeah, we work a lot with Dr. Ben Bidoff from the Department of Primary Industries in West Australia, and he's sort of suggesting, he's actually running workshops yesterday and today on identification. He's sort of suggesting it's sort of 20% of the area has had some frost impact, but 10% of the area is probably relatively severe. So I guess if you look at that, that's a hit, and when we think about 10% or 20%, what we sometimes miss in there is the fact that for some people, a frost in spring is devastating. So 20% of the people out there are suffering somewhat, but 10% are probably suffering an awful lot. You know, big losses, big financial losses, but emotionally just really, really bad for them.
Yeah, especially when the crop has been looking so good, and all the opportunities with the prices are looking pretty positive. But that's I guess Mother Nature and what we have to deal with. But is it somewhat unique in the grains industry globally that Australia has to handle this particular problem?
Yes, in fact it is. That yes, there are cold conditions elsewhere in the world, but not necessarily at the time that we experience damage. So in the southern hemisphere, South American countries, in particular, but in the southern African countries, they experience what we call spring radiation frosts. But in the northern hemisphere, they're relatively rare because they actually produce out of season, or opposite to that. They have their frosts after planting or before planting, and they have less of an issue as the crops are during their reproductive stages at the end of the year. So it is different, and they have some varietal choice based on freezing young plants, and we have to think about the freezing of older plants. So
Yeah.
there's not a lot we can learn from them. In fact, we probably lead the world, I would think, in terms of frost research and frost adaptation.
Yeah, and that comes down to varieties, I guess, as well. The researcher, we're next door here to AGT, for instance, at Roseworthy. They do some research into that, among other resistances and tolerances. So that's something Australia has to keep doing.
There's no doubt about that. I mean, the holy grail would be to have resistant wheat, barley, and all the pulses, lentils, faba beans, canola. But unfortunately, at this stage, there isn't really anything there, and it's probably going to be some considerable time, I would think, before we get any genuine tolerance. So what we have at the moment are tiny little bits of tolerance, maybe a 0.1 or a 0.2 degree here and there. Now they're small, but they're relatively important. But there are a lot of other things that are just as important, like, and I guess one historically has been that trying to avoid the frost by having that vulnerable period. If we said, roughly in a cereal crop, that's from the booting stage through to early grain fill, to have that happening after you think the last frost has occurred, or after the last damaging frost. So we may be able to change the or choose varieties that are a bit later maturing. It doesn't always work, of course, because we don't always know when the frost is going to be, but certainly in some areas of the state, the odds are that you may be able to get away with it.
What I guess where I live in the Barossa Valley, you see these big fans up in the vineyards to deal with frost, but you're dealing with many more acres or hectares when it comes to grain. Is there any form of mitigation other than the timing of your seeding to get around the frost or try and mitigate its impacts?
Certainly the idea of frost fans is great for small areas such as viticulture, but it doesn't work on a broad scale area because of the footprint of the air movement they create. So yes, they might protect an area if they can continue the movement of air through a landscape. So the air passes from one frost fan to another, that works, or the mixing of air just directly around each of those frost fans. But that has a very, very limited area, tens to hundreds of metres, not kilometres, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, like my young fella's 10 and he sees them in the vineyard and he goes, "How does that help at all?" It's a fair question. Now, just
look, obviously it's not going to work on a broad acre basis, so we have to think of all the other things. And a lot of those other things might just add a 0.1 or a 0.2 here and there. And of course, we might also say, look, we're not going to get around it. In some parts of the landscape, and I call them the red zones, we're not going to get around it. We're unlikely that we're going to avoid it. So we have to think what else we may be able to do in those landscapes. The things that are slightly more tolerant, and the things that have dual purpose. So if we do happen to get frosted, we can perhaps cut off a hay, and that hay has a value.
Yeah.
There's no point cutting hay if it has no value or no market.
Yeah. Now, there's always this raging discussion about climate change. We'll be talking about it elsewhere on Flow in the next couple of days. Those red zones, for instance, that you mentioned, is there any noticeable difference over the last decade or two about whether there's more or less frost issues or those red zones?
I think the farmers I talk to on a regular basis would say that their frost damage is more widespread and more consistent now. And and the work that CSIRO have done has shown the frost window, if we like to call it that, the period where we get damaging frost has actually widened over the last 10 to 15 years. So it now goes from, depending on the environment, but it goes from August through until November. And it's hard to avoid in that total period of time avoiding getting some frost. So I think the farmer feedback is that their damage is getting worse. It's hurting them more, and the future projections, just at this stage, future projections are that frost will get worse in the short term, and then maybe after a period of years they might actually reduce. But if we actually just look at the more arid environments in Australia to our north, they're warm. They're very, very warm, but they still get very severe frosts. If you look at the temperature of Alice Springs, for example.
Yep.
So just having a warmer, drier prediction of temperatures doesn't actually mean that we're going to have any reduction in frost incidents, and probably the outcome would be we'll have more frost.
Well, Mick Faulkner, thanks for that breakdown. Very useful for us as we see the crops looking a bit white and frosty out in the land. There's a very complex picture, and appreciate your work on it.
No worries. Thank you.